All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to dig into something that shapes our lives every single day, whether we realize it or not, the very foundations of our legal system.
So, have you ever stopped to think, really think, where do our laws come from? It sounds like such a simple question, right? But trust me, the answer is way more complex, and honestly, a lot more fascinating than you'd probably guess. Because, see, it's not like they all come from one single place. Nope. Our legal system is more like this living, breathing organism. It's all woven together from three totally different threads. You've got the written down rules, you've got the decisions that judges make, and then you have these deep, ancient traditions that have been around forever. And there's actually a whole field of study dedicated to this. It's called jurisprudence. You can think of it as the science or maybe the philosophy of law. It's the field that gives us the tools to really unpack where our laws come from and how they actually work. So that's going to be our framework.
Okay, so let's start with the one we're probably all most familiar with, the most obvious source of law, the written law. Formally, we call this legislation.
This is law at its most straightforward. We're talking about the actual formal rules that are enacted, written down by a government's lawmaking body, like a parliament or Congress. So anytime you see a news headline about a new bill being passed, yep, that's legislation in action. But here's the thing. Not all legislation is created equal. There's a definite pecking order. At the very top, you've got what's called supreme legislation. This stuff comes from the highest authority in the land, and no other body can legally overturn it. But then, underneath that, you have subordinate legislation. This is made by smaller bodies, say a university setting its own regulations or your local city council making bylaws. They get their power from the supreme authority, which also means that supreme authority can control or even get rid of their rules. Okay, so written laws are great, they're the bedrock, but they can't predict the future, right? They can't possibly cover every single situation that could ever come up. So what happens when a law is a little vague or a brand new, never before seen problem pops up? Well, that's where our second source of law comes into play, the interpreted law, known as precedent. And this is where judges and the courts become so incredibly important. See, when a judge decides a case, their judgment doesn't just affect that one situation. It can actually create a new rule, a precedent. And that new rule then becomes binding. That means lower courts have to follow it whenever a similar case comes along in the future. This whole system is built on a really important principle called stare decisis. It's a Latin term, and it basically means to stand by things decided, or more simply, don't mess with what's already settled. It's this core belief that you should stick with past rulings. And this is huge, because it's what gives our legal system consistency and predictability. It's why things aren't just a total free-for-all. So when a judge writes a really long decision, how do you find the actual rule in there that everyone has to follow? Well, you have to look for something called the ratio decidendi. I know, another Latin term, but it just means the reason for the decision. This is the absolute core legal principle, the essential logic the whole thing is built on. That's the part that's binding. That's the precedent. And then there's pretty much everything else in the judgment. This other stuff is called obiter dicta, which literally means things said by the way. It's kind of like the judge's side commentary. They're hypothetical examples, they're extra thoughts. It's not the binding rule, but you don't want to ignore it. This stuff can be super persuasive for judges in future cases. And if you want to see just how powerful this can be, look at some of these landmark cases from India. These decisions literally changed the course of the nation. Take the case of Ananda Bharti case. It created the basic structure doctrine, which is a judge-made rule that says there are fundamental parts of the Constitution that Parliament just can't change. Think about that. That wasn't a law passed by politicians, it was an interpretation by judges that became law itself. So are all precedents created equal? Not really. Some are way more powerful than others. A precedent's authority, its power level if you will, gets a massive boost if the decision was unanimous, or if there were a ton of judges on the bench. If higher courts give it a thumbs up later on, that helps too. And the ultimate power up, when the legislature actually passes a new law that confirms the very same principle. But it's not just about getting stronger. A precedent's power can also be weakened, or even wiped out completely. This can happen if a higher court straight up overrules it, or if it turns out it clashes with an existing written law, or even if it's just decided the original decision was just plain wrong. It's like the legal system has these built-in ways to correct itself. All right, we've covered the written laws and the judge-made laws. Now, let's dig deeper.
We're going to peel back the final layer to get to the oldest, most fundamental source of law there is: custom.
Think about it. Way before anyone was writing down laws or building courthouses, how did people live together? They were guided by customs. These are the unwritten rules, the codes of behavior that everyone in a community just accepts and follows. It's just been done that way for generations. A lot of our modern laws about things like marriage or who gets your property when you die, their roots go all the way back to these ancient unwritten customs. There was this legal historian, Sir Henry Maine, who had a really cool theory about how this happens. He said it unfolds in stages. First, a ruler makes a judgment, maybe saying it came from the gods. Over time, doing what the ruler said becomes a habit, then a tradition, a custom for the whole community. Then, maybe a special group, like priests, become the keepers and interpreters of these customs. And finally, the last step is codification. That's when someone finally writes it all down, turning that ancient custom into a formal, official law.
But, a court can't just accept any old tradition as law. For a custom to get that official stamp of approval, it has to pass a whole bunch of really strict tests. It's got to be ancient, so old no one even remembers when it started. It has to be reasonable, not totally ridiculous. It must have been followed continuously, without any breaks. It also has to be clear, certain, and feel like a real binding obligation. And here's the big one. A custom can never beat a written law from Parliament. Statute law always wins.
Okay, so we've got our three big sources: legislation, precedent, and custom. But the key thing to remember is that these don't exist in separate boxes. They're all mixed up together, interacting in some really fascinating ways.
Think of it like a conversation that's always happening. An ancient custom might be the spark for a brand new piece of legislation, but once that law is written, judges have to interpret it, which in turn creates new precedents. It's this constant back and forth that makes our legal system so amazing. It's stable, but it's not stuck. It can actually change and evolve as society changes.
A really good way to visualize how all these three things work together is to think of our entire legal system as a giant, living tree. Let's break that down. Custom, that's the fertile soil. It's the ancient, rich ground that everything else grows out of. Then you have precedent. That's the deep root system and the strong trunk, giving the whole tree its strength, its structure, its stability. And legislation, well, that's the leaves and the branches. It's the part we see the most, the part that's actively growing and reacting to the world around it, but it's all supported by that powerful trunk and nourished by that ancient soil. It's a pretty cool way to see how it all connects, right? It shows us where our law comes from and how it stands today. But it also leaves us with one last big question to think about. As our world keeps changing faster and faster, which part of that tree do you think is going to hold the most power in shaping our future? The soil, the trunk, or the branches?